His France 24 film critic, Lisa Nesselson, Claude Lanzmann's life, enough to fill the stories of 3 or 4 lifetimes for most people. This movie, we saw in the clip talking about how it took him nearly as long as the Nazis were in power to make it, 11 years. And, you know, if you tell people who don't know much about movies, you're going to watch this movie now and it's just a bunch of interviews, you think, oh my God, that sounds really boring. It is so captivating. 9.5 hours. What is it about Shoah?
It's that it's the irrefutable evidence of a crime against humanity that it is still almost impossible to wrap a normal mind around. He just methodically documented things. Nothing is up for grabs. If someone wants to be a Holocaust denier, and the word Shoah means a unique catastrophe beyond, there have been genocides before and after, but this systematic obliteration of in the neighborhood of 6 million people. I mean, there in the clip, they were quibbling about whether we killed this many thousand or that many thousand. That documentation is just irrefutable. And the more you watch it, the more you think, this is the proof.
And it doesn't drag. That's what's amazing about it.
No, it doesn't drag because, well, I know they had an enormous amount of footage to pick from. He and his heroic editor spent 4 years in the editing room. And imagine distilling all of that and making a coherent story about what is absolutely inexpressibly wretched and horrible beyond belief. Something that I'd like to bring up is that all of this work was done in the analog era, when you had to load tape into tape recorders, when you had to load celluloid film into cameras. There is one moment in Shoah when a survivor of the camps is talking to Lanzmann, and he's operating under that facade of life goes on, and there's a moment when he cracks. And Lanzmann has said, had he not decided to reload the film in the camera, the roll of film lasts 11 minutes. You can't get around that. Had he not decided to reload the camera when he did, then that man's emotions still would have been there, but not for eternity, not for posterity, not for as long as film lasts. So those kinds of decisions. Also, his work as a journalist, we're talking about writing things down with a pencil and paper and a typewriter, you know, and if you were lucky, maybe sending a terse, succinct cable or telegram. Our means of communication now are so instantaneous, but are we thinking as hard as an intellectual giant like he did?
The term Shoah, which comes from the Hebrew, it has come into the French language thanks to Claude Lanzmann.
Well, you know, when you think that when Shoah came out in 1985, and people were going to theaters, they, you know, perhaps were a little daunted, not so much at the 10-hour investment, but I think you had to buy 4 separate tickets to go and see it. But you would sort of look forward to it because the story was so involved, so complex. And I'm always fascinated by people who edit documentary because there's so many directions you can go in. But they found a way to shape the material so that you get the accretion of evidence, and you can never, ever go back. You see what you've seen, you hear what you've heard, and he did all this legwork so that nobody else has to. Of course, since then, there was so many leftover interviews that he's gotten another few masterful documentaries out of that material, completing, you know, the story.
He in his autobiography, talks about he's in the French Resistance when he's still 16, 17 years old. And up until his death, he's still the editor of that literary magazine, Les Temps Modernes, which was co-founded by all the great left bank intellectuals after World War II. And he was still making movies.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't say he was cut down in his prime at 92, but had his health permitted, I think he could have gone on firing on all cylinders. Some people just get a lot done. And historically, he was sort of in all the places that the 20th century had to offer.
You were here 24 hours ago reviewing his latest offering.
Indeed. And this is The Four Sisters. He had interviews of 4 women, 2 from Poland, 1 from Czechoslovakia, and 1 from Transylvania, who had been sent to the camps and statistically should not have survived, but did. And he did extensive interviews with them and decided to call these 4 films together Four Sisters, although they were not blood relatives in any way. But it's just him asking pointed, journalistic, thoughtful questions and their answers. And it is absolutely riveting. He and his not-so-friendly nemesis, Marcel Ophuls, who is himself now 90, were if these men had not existed, I'm not sure how we would refer to this period in human history. Both Frenchmen, both incredibly gifted, wily interviewers and journalists capable of holding an enormous amount of information in their heads.
So Lanzmann changes the way we look at the Holocaust, at the Shoah. Does he change the way we look at documentary filmmaking?
Well, he invented a form, I think. I mean, there's nothing quite like the cinematic object of Shoah. And it's storytelling, but the stories are true. The pieces he's assembled make it, like you said, riveting. I don't think, I excuse everyone out there, you don't have to read Proust unless you really want to. But I think everybody should watch Shoah, because how better could you understand man's inhumanity to man?
Back in 2011, for France 24's 5th birthday celebration, we had the privilege of welcoming Claude Lanzmann for a special edition of the France 24 debate in this very studio. It was during the Arab Spring at the time, and I asked him if the course of history had surprised this stalwart of anti-colonialism.
I am always careful when one has to judge the past in a retrospective way with what we know now. Right, because we were blind, but it is truth. But it is a plain truth of men thrown into history. We have been blind in many respects, but we have been farsighted too.
Very interesting, because here's a man who's true to the leftist, with Jean-Paul Sartre, fighting colonialism. He went to Algeria, was alongside the FLN, and yet saying, yeah, partly we were blind to what was going on, but partly we were true to ourselves.
Well, I think it's difficult for us to understand the sheer ebullition of ideas that people were just, socialism, communism, liberation movements, the founding of Israel. It was all incredibly exciting. And tomorrow morning, every newspaper in France is going to have this man's face on the cover. But in an era when people got most of their news from newspapers, from magazines, from something like the Les Temps Modernes, he edited an issue that was 1,000 pages thick, where he gave people on the Arab side and people on the Israeli side a chance to express themselves about what their various disagreements consisted of. Now that would be a few sound bites. So that thoroughness of just saying, okay, people are up in arms about something, or people are enthusiastic and excited about something. I mean, you could argue that Simone de Beauvoir helped invent a certain kind of feminism. And here's a guy who's like a guy's guy. He's like a wrestler and a pugnacious rugby player, but out there being Mr. Intellectual. He went to, and yet they were romantic partners in the finest sense of the word. And he was 17 years younger than she was. But nothing could make him embarrassed about pursuing his intellectual interests from 1970 on film, but he never, ever stopped writing.
Lisa Nesselson, France 24 film critic, many thanks. And we have more on the death of Claude Lanzmann and his life on our website, france24.com.